You're listening to Were You Still Talking?
They pump out your blood and they pump in a new batch of blood, and all of it is the blood of children.
All the big stars are going to be on TV now. I mean, it's just the way it's going. Your role, I think, will be played by Brad Pitt.
What'd you wear?
I wore my loincloth wrapped around my feet.
Are you going by John today?
And that's absolutely true. You feel it in every cell in your body.
Yeah, you can bend the truth and bend the visualizations no matter what your political affiliation.
You could have an alpaca. A girlfriend's daughter recently got married and they had llamas or alpacas at the wedding.
A recording room. They recorded a couple songs in the kitchen of Rumbo.
So, wait, you microdosed before this, right?
What? Hey, welcome back. You are still listening to Were You Still Talking? And this is still Joel Albrecht. And today I'm going to talk about something that's very near and dear to me. It's something I worry about. It's something that's on my mind a lot. It's something that I think should be the number one issue in politics and maybe in business as well, probably. I'm going to talk about global warming. It's believe it or not, something I believe in, and I know most of the people listening to this probably also believe in it. The fact that there's some people who don't, or some people who are fighting against the very idea, is kind of nuts to me. But I am really, really happy to have someone in the studio who is working on it, who is helps me feel a little more positive about it, just knowing that someone like this exists. So today on the show, we have Dr. James Stalker. He is an American high-tech entrepreneur since 2002. Dr. Stalker is CEO of the Enterprise Universe, which is something I'm going to get into with him. He has a really long resume. He went to a lot of schools. He has a Ph.D. and 2 master's degrees, from what I understand, and a bachelor's degree. There was at least 4 degrees that I looked at, masters of bachelor's and mechanical engineering. He's an atmospheric scientist, and he has a Ph.D. in atmospheric science. He started his own company to help people understand global warming, and it's kind of involved, so I don't completely understand it, but I'm going to get into it, and I'm going to find out. I'm going to ask him a lot of things, like, are we going to survive? So, Dr. Stalker, thank you very much for being on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you, Joel. It's a pleasure being on your show.
Yeah, I'm really honored to have you. I really appreciate the work you're doing because, as I said in my intro, I'm very nervous about the state of the globe. We in Oregon had a really good dose of it last year. Oregon and California. California's coming at it again, where we have fire seasons that are longer and longer. Last year, I think it was our worst fire season on record, if not the worst, the second worst. In the town that I'm in, we were engulfed in smoke for days. So, yeah, it affects everyone. And I'm kind of wondering, before we get into what your company does, how did you, at what point did you decide that was going to be your life's work? Because it is your life's work, and, you're working very hard on climate research. Did that happen before you went to school? Were you already on that path, or did that happen along the road? When did?
Well, great question, Joel. Not at all. I wasn't thinking about the climate. I wasn't even thinking about the weather. I was an engineering student, focused on computational fluid dynamics, and I did really well for my master's degree at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. And my advisor at the time, after my defense of my master's program, we were talking over lunch, and he said, I asked him, I'd like to continue to get my PhD in this area. And he said, are you kidding me? What you did today, most of us don't really know much about. So you've done more than a lot of us. So you don't want to waste 4 years getting a PhD in computational fluid dynamics. So I said, okay, well, then I have to really look for an area where I can use this knowledge. And I was already working with another professor from the same university in the weather department, atmospheric science department. So I went to him and I said, Kevin Knupp, I'm interested in pursuing a PhD program within the department. And I was already working with him part-time until when I was in mechanical engineering. So he said, yeah, we would love to have you. You're a good student, and I really enjoy that. So that's how I got into weather, not knowing much about what the weather was going to be like, what my life's work was going to be like. But I knew my background in computational fluid dynamics was going to help, Joel. So that was really the thought process when I went into the program. And then, of course, after my PhD in 1997, I joined Los Alamos National Lab in New Mexico. Kind of fell in love with the mountains there, not the research program. But
yeah, that's
the
beautiful
research
there.
program was kind of like a side item, but I ended up really doing well there for a number of years before I started my company, my first company, I should say, on weather. And that was weather at the time, still no climate. Mind you, in early 2000s, I was still a weather researcher. And I'd like to tell you about the difference between the two, so you know how I kind of evolved from weather-focused research to climate too. So the real difference between the two, Joel, is weather is usually in the 1 to 10, maybe 1 to 15, 20-day range in forecasting. But if you do anything longer than that, that becomes a climate issue. So if you're talking about a variability over a long period of time, years at times, or 10 years, or even 20, 30, even 100 years, what is the variability and what's causing it? That would be part of climate science. And weather is more like day to day up to 20, 25 days, even sometimes 30 days, but you will kind of go from weather to climate after those time scales.
That's a really good explanation, because I never really would have thought of that. So the weather report we get every day is more of a short-term forecast. It's a different science, and climate science is looking at the years of climate, the years of what happens.
Right. Yeah. So because I was focusing on weather for my science, particularly for my PhD work involved in severe weather, like multi-cell thunderstorms, supercells that spawn tornadoes. And I was actually chasing tornadoes, by the way, when I was in Alabama.
Oh, wow. Well, I want to hear about that too.
Yeah, which my wife tells me, when we met, you never told me about that. And I was like, what would have happened if I told you? And she's like, oh, you know what the answer would be. So, but then, focused on the short-term weather forecasting and assessing for my research, and also at the company, I was looking at wind project development and forecasting early on. And then I developed interest in solar assessment forecasting, also using the same technology. But the breadth of that grew over the last 15, 20 years. And I said, well, the climate folks are not doing any better too. So what could I do with my technology to help that science also? So that's really how my interest in climate science grew.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you actually saw a gap in the science, really. You saw that it wasn't, people were missing something. And that
it's actually a gaping hole.
It's a gaping hole, okay.
Joel, because without that, I wouldn't have put my colleagues in such situation. But because the gap is so large, we're talking about 90% data gap.
Oh, wow.
Versus having only 10% of the information. If it was only 2%, 3% difference for my method, I would have said, nah, don't worry about it. But no, it's actually a pretty large gap. And again, I was able to do that because of my computational fluid dynamics background. before I went into the weather science. And that allowed me to understand what was missing and how much the data gap is. And in climate science, for example, Joel, it's actually even larger, that gap is. And because of that, I would not be able to sit on the sidelines and say, let the politicians and my scientist colleagues do whatever. I just could not do that because of that large data gap.
That's really interesting. And when did you discover the gap? When did you figure out that this the science that everyone's using isn't really working?
It's another great question, and it's going to lead to some of my key elements of my story, Joel. So when I was a researcher at Los Alamos National Lab, I had a comfy job. I didn't really have to answer to anyone, but when I started my company and I was trying to give them products, I wanted to make sure, Joel, my products were the best that I could give them.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that my desire to give them the best as a vendor, not as someone who wants to make money and give them whatever I can. That's really not how I approach business. So my desire to give them the best product really drove me to this method.
And that's always my theory has always been if all capitalists thought that way, we would have a much different society than we do now.
I hope so too. You're right. And I want to change that a little bit because I came up with these 9 fundamentals. So to answer your question, after I started my company in 2002, I was still trying to work my products and try to get some clients on board. I think it didn't happen until maybe 2005 timeframe, when I had the idea and also had the Stalker method, as it's now known as. At that time, I didn't know what it would be called or what it would be like, but I knew a method was in the making. And then, of course, Joel, that had to be implemented into a model. A method is a method, but you really have to have a working algorithm fully baked into a model and validated. That took me a long time, multiple years actually down the road.
And that's got to be hard also to be, creating your own model when there's already one that everyone's using. That's got to be a big challenge. And so can you tell me a little bit about it? Like the difference that your method compared to what everyone else is using right now?
So that's another great question. And I think you did your research. So here is what it is, Joel. Back in the day when the science was in its infancy, maybe 50 years, after Second World War, we had more observations coming out and people were creating conceptual models and things like that. But there was no computational resource available at the time. Mm-hmm. Computational resource came about later on, much like in the late 80s to early 90s, just about the time when I was in graduate school, just happened to be the right time. But before then, a lot of the science works were essentially based on observations. So when I say observations, I want to make a distinction. When you're measuring wind speed or temperature or relative humidity, these are measured by all the sensors. And then what do you do where you have no measurements at another location? So you end up using your measurements at the location you have them and then extrapolate or interpolate to a location where you have no measurements. That has been the science, and I actually call it state variable science because it's relying on observations of the state variables like wind speed, temperature, relative humidity, and so forth. But what's deficient in that method or approach, Joel, is these state variables are changing all the time. If you measure wind speed, for example, and you look at a time series, it's going up and down all the time. Mm-hmm. Why is that? There are lots of reasons. And those reasons are what I call physical processes related to clouds, related to solar radiation, related to transport and mixing. All those things are causing your wind speed to change, go up and down. But those physical processes are not measured, and they're not modeled also accurately by the models that are being employed. So my method is about enabling those underlying physical processes instead of just interpolating or extrapolating. So that's really the best way I would describe without using a lot of jargon.
And that's pretty shocking. That's pretty surprising. I've studied weather a little bit because I got my pilot's license years ago. So, you have to study at least what clouds are and why it's windy in the morning or less windy in the morning and things like this. So I never even considered the fact that there wasn't, I don't know, I guess a model for why all this is happening. I always just assumed there was. So that's really pretty shocking that there wasn't, that didn't exist before.
Don't feel bad, Joel. I actually got a Ph.D. Without realizing it. I actually published a lot of papers myself without realizing it. Because of the science, the way it's practiced now for the last 5-6 decades. So there's nothing wrong with it, just how the science was practiced. And because there was no computational resource available, which is required by my method. My method is costly because it requires a lot of computing. But because it wasn't there, they were relying on small amounts of observations and developing some conceptual models, which included me also. But after the fact that the computing was available, I was kind of doing really well in that area. And then my desire to create the best products I could for my clients. Really, I cannot emphasize how important that was. If I were just a researcher without a client in mind, I probably wouldn't have arrived at where I arrived at. That's a guess, but that's really a good guess.
Right. And that's an interesting, one of my questions was going to be why for-profit rather than nonprofit, because a lot of organizations doing what you do seem to be in the nonprofit world, but that kind of answered that question. It was actually a customer service and profit motivator that I don't know, steered you towards the idea of making a better product and that there's something missing. So it's interesting.
You are right about that. I will throw just one more point at it as far as nonprofit versus for-profit. In my view, for-profit really kind of lives within its means and saves some money.
True.
Unlike the nonprofit, which will spend the whole amount they get. So that's the only difference I see as far as for-profit or nonprofit. Of course, there's another caveat, and that is a lot of the folks on the for-profit side, unlike me, they're only chasing profits. They're not interested in really creating the best products for the client. So I'm not going to generalize it, but that's usually the case where their interest is really about making profits and increasing that profit margin than actually helping the client, which is what the nonprofits do to do better. So I do agree the dichotomy between the two, but when I'm in the desire of creating the best products for my clients, it doesn't really matter whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit organization.
And the organizations that are interested in your products, are they big business, small business, government? Like what kind of different people do you work with?
Joel, being in the renewable energy early on, wind project developers was what I focused on. These are small to medium-sized organizations. So I was really not looking at the retail end or the largest, customers like big businesses or even governments and that type of thing. At that time, that was my focus, really to help some developers who are relying on small amount of information to design a project, for example. I used to tell them how nutty that was to use such small amount of information and throw in hundreds of millions of dollars into a project. I said, this is really not the way to do it. So what is the alternative? So I used to tell them about that. But as far as now, Joel, because of the expansion of the vision, I'm really focusing on governments, state governments in our country or country governments across the globe, where they need to have a product like this to understand their resources better and then optimize those resources. That's really kind of like one of the main buckets of benefits for my product. But then, of course, the second bucket is really just as important. That is minimizing your losses too. Losses from your droughts, losses from your flooding, lightning, wildfires, smoke, and all of that. So how do you mitigate? That's also part of the second bucket in what I call loss mitigation efforts. And the third bucket for my product and my technology expertise, Joel, is how to quantify your carbon footprint, like your state's footprint or your country's footprint. And if you're taking any measures, like taking carbon out of it or not use fossil fuel energy, and any type of measure that you're taking, you still have to make sure that effort is going to actually produce the result that you're looking for. So if you're unable to quantify it, then whatever you're doing is really not going to give you any type of understanding. And that's what this technology is about.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because we're going full steam, for instance, to electric vehicles. I think we're going to really change over in the next 20 years where you're not going to see many gas vehicles. That's going to be a classic car. I don't know how much science is really behind the difference that's going to make. I mean, what is from what you've seen, what kind of difference would that change make going from getting off fossil fuels in the vehicle market?
Yeah, vehicles still have to use energy, right, Joe?
Right.
So you have battery, but what's charging the battery? So if you don't pay attention to that, if the fossil fuel energy is charging your battery just because you're using it as an electric vehicle, of course, it's going to kind of minimize your carbon, the pollutants that you're going to put from burning oil and gas. But what is the source of energy for your battery? That's the important thing that one has to understand. So long as that's there, then the benefit is going to be there. But unfortunately, that's really not the case because the batteries are charged from your grid outlet, which is using the conventional energy. So it's really another form of energy using the same carbon.
Using the same carbon. And what some people don't understand is that the grid is nationwide everywhere but Texas. And it's so, yeah, I mean, because in Oregon, we're moving towards green power and have used green power for something like 50 years, although some of that green power coming from dams is still damaging, to a lot of things. But it's not as polluting to the air. It still damages rivers. And now we're trying to move towards wind power and other types of power. But it's something like 10 to 20% of the power because we still get a massive amount of power from the nationwide grid. And like you say, that could be coal plants, that can be energy plants using oil, all kinds of things. So that's kind of what I was getting at and also what's the cost manufacturing all these batteries and then disposing of all these batteries. And I should say this, a caveat to this is I love electric and I'm planning on getting an electric car next, but I'm just trying to, get someone's opinion of this who's got, who knows the science, better than I do.
It's only one side of the equation. So it is good to get. I'm not really discouraging anyone from getting it. But you also want to make sure the source of energy to charge your battery is also clean, maybe from wind and solar hydro combination. Of course, hydro has some issues in terms of its ecological effect on certain species and things like that, which are reasonable concerns for anyone. But Joel, we are part of the system as human beings,
Right.
so we really have to do the trade-off. But doing the trade-off more intelligently, I think, is the better choice than saying, okay, coal is bad, that's good, and you just cannot do that. You really have to come up with a common sense way of understanding and elevating everything simultaneously. But that really takes cutting edge technology, science, and expertise, Joel. And that's one thing that I'm hoping to offer to the world through this technology that I built.
And that's amazing. I mean, that's what we need is better technology, obviously. Because I know that big government and in fact small government often puts money places quickly and inefficiently. They will often try to do things without looking at a lot of research. So it's great that you're trying to change what they have available.
I agree. Politicians have short time windows. They have to do things in 2 years or 4 years. If you're lucky, you get 8 years. So that's usually not the case. So you have a time frame where you want to finish something, but you have to rely on the proper scientists. Again, I don't want to say anything negative about my scientist colleagues, but they have to embrace new techniques, methods that come out, on a constant basis. So science 10 years ago or 5 years ago or even 2 years ago is not the same. So that's something that my colleagues have a problem too. Mm-hmm. And translating that to politicians sometimes gets lost. So the politicians run with whatever popular thing that's being talked about. And that's unfortunately not the way to go about it. So I'll tell you this again, Joel. We could achieve same economic output without messing with the environment, provided we have the proper science to allow us to understand both. And if you're not understanding both, then you have to favor one over the other, and then there's always friction politically.
Right, and then I've actually believed this for at least 50 years. When I was younger, this climate change or global warming was brought to my attention probably 50 years ago when I was just out of high school. People started talking about the ice caps melting and the damage. I really didn't think we were going to be around this long. I mean, at that time, there was some talk that that society wouldn't be around because of flooding and different things, which we're now seeing more and more of every year. I mean, we're seeing the signs of it kind of brighter and brighter and brighter. But there have been scientists like yourself who've talked about the fact that, yes, we can have both. We can have a society, we can have industry, that's the word I'm looking for, and it can be green industry. There was an incredible book that I read about 20 years ago called Natural Capitalism. Can't remember the authors, but they had have you ever heard of that book?
No.
It was basically about the differences that companies could make to put less impact on the environment. And in their book, every example they could find, the company made more money when they did this. And I totally it was interesting.
With that. Yeah. I never read this book, Joel, but I totally agree with the fact that we could do both. Mm-hmm. But here is the reason why people don't do it too, Joel. Because of the hard work I put in, it's not an easy thing to do.
Right. Right.
Think about that, because if I worked for somebody else and I was only looking out for my own livelihood, mm-hmm. I probably wouldn't have been able to do what I have done. So I decided to kind of sacrifice my own, personal well-being to develop these things for the world. So that's really what it took. And if I didn't do that, probably we would be looking at the same problem. But right now, what I'm facing, Joel, is the politicians are saying, well, 97% of the scientists say it's all settled. And Dr. Stalker says, no, it's not settled because there isn't enough data. So they go by the numbers. 97% say it's right, then it is right. So it's not. So I'm facing on the scientific front as well as the political front. But the bottom line is this, Joel, when you mobilize all these resources, funding and, political capital and things like that, but in the end, if you're not solving the problem, after spending all that money and all of that, the problem is still going to exist. What are you going to do? And I know it's going to be the case because the science is not there. The solutions are not going to perform as expected using the old science. That's really my message. And it is urgent. I don't share the urgency of some folks like, okay, we're messing with the environment, we're going to be doomed and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
As a scientist, I can't say that too until I understand it fully. So that's really where this technology is going to help us quantify it better. So we could take some measures that are actually meaningfully influencing that climate that we want to take care of for not only for us, but for the future.
So your method is not in agreement with other methods. Does that mean the changes in climate aren't as bad from when you do the math, I guess, do the computations, or they're not happening as fast, or they're just not as drastic?
So a great question again, Joel. So it's a central point for what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I will describe it this way. There are only 3 scenarios that can happen realistically without knowing the science, without knowing the data or my method. 3 scenarios. It's warming, it's staying the same, or it's cooling. Those are the 3.
Okay.
But current science and observations and models will not be able to quantify that global warming, that cooling, or it would not be able to identify neutral condition also. That's really the challenge that I see for the science. It's unable to give you the accurate deviation in the warmth area or in the cold side of it. So you will not be able to quantify either 3 of those scenarios. And that's really is the crux of the problem that I see. And that's what my technology is going to solve.
Oh, okay.
So I cannot say if somebody says 2 degrees or 5 degrees,
right,
I would say you are unable to quantify that. I'm not coming up with my own number until we do this globally. But until then, you cannot quantify whether that's 2 degrees, 5 degrees Celsius, because we do not have the science to quantify it.
Well, that's very interesting because you do see different numbers all the time. I mean, it seems like every year there's a new article from a different research that does have a different number. It's 5 degrees warmer than 10 years ago. It's 2 degrees warmer than it's 3 degrees warmer. So that's interesting. The things that seem easier to quantify is how much ice is melting and disappearing, those kind of things.
Those
measurements
are regional phenomena, right?
Okay.
So,
yeah.
But then we're talking about global warming or cooling. So you have to put all of that in the context of what's going on globally.
Right.
That's really the issue. I mean, we see polar bears suffering and ice shields melting and breaking off. We see that. Visually, that's true.
Mm-hmm.
That's happening. But what is the effect of that on global warming or cooling? That's something that we cannot do. So that's why having a robust model that's done globally, including the ice melting and deforestation and all of the things that we do, fossil fuel energy, all of their net effects have to be understood and quantified fully for us to be able to come up with that number that we are unable to do right now.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. That's a tough one because that seems like then people are just what people are doing to try and slow global warming or reverse it is not based on any sound science. Is that what you mean?
It is at least archaic science.
Archaic
I wouldn't
science.
say not
Okay.
sound, but it hasn't enough data in it to be able to quantify it accurately. So
Mhm.
that's really what I'm pointing out. Because if you agree that there is a data gap, you may not agree the data gap is such a large one, but even if you agree there is a data gap, what is that data gap going to do to your quantification? Whether you're saying that's 2 degrees or 5 degrees, that's a huge thing that you would not know until it is done. So I'm not in a camp of supporting the left or right on this.
Right.
It's not
Right.
political to me. It's mostly about science. In fact, I'm going really against the science that has been archaic for a while, and we want to improve that science to help our policymakers. That isn't being done so far, and I'm hoping to be able to do that.
Well, and that's there's I think a really unfortunate thing happening in politics now where it's all political. So, one side says they want to help with this program, another side says they don't. It doesn't exist. It's not real, and it's all based on who they're trying to please on a television screen. So I don't know if they've been basing anything on science for a while, but they definitely need help.
I have gotten a little bit of that cold shoulder response by my colleagues. Whether they belong to the left or the right wing of the climate change. But I always said, we have to look at this objectively and then improve it. Because the bottom line, Joel, is this. If we're unable to find the answers in the end, no matter how much you mobilize and invest maybe billions and trillions of dollars, but the California is still burning.
Right.
Or Miami is still underwater, rising sea level threat. What then, right? So we have to make sure the science is going to be able to perform. So that's really what my focus has been, and I'm hoping to bring that to the forefront.
And that makes complete sense. If you don't have the science, you're not going to get it right. It's going to be very difficult to move forward.
So one thing I would say, Joel, in that, let's say Oregon decided to increase their renewable energy by 50 gigawatts in the next 5 years, as an example, hypothetical. So hoping that their carbon footprint is going to be minimized by 50%. I'm throwing another wild number there. But after 5 years, spending 50 gigawatts investments, your carbon footprint hasn't changed. Then what? Right?
Right.
So you are unable to understand the effect of your measures on the system itself because of the archaic science.
Well, that makes complete sense. So what we're doing is if you don't have the right measurements, it's hard to make the right changes. Yeah.
And that's because of the flaw that I found as a researcher, and then built a method, but implemented that into a model that's capable of enabling these underlying physical processes, which has taken a lot of my time.
Right. And so you actually have a group of companies working on this, though. Is that right?
Right now, I'm adding a few other companies, including my global company called the Enterprise Universe. And if you have some questions, I could go into that. But the idea really is changing this stigma about being a businessman. They're cutthroat, they're only for themselves. All they do is get money and nothing else. I want to change that. So because of that vision that I have certain fundamentals that I want us to follow, but also as an example for others to follow too. So I have built a couple of other companies, and I'm bringing a lot of senior people into into the enterprise universe. But Resper is definitely the simulation company.
Oh, okay. That's the company that's doing the climate simulation.
Climate stuff, right?
Uh-huh. And what does the other companies do? What's some of the stuff they do?
There is a renewable energy company, Joel, that I also created. It just turned out 10 years later, after my first company, after doing the marketing and development in the renewable energy, I decided to, patent a concept where this renewable energy actually creates load right next to the generation, than producing energy and putting into the grid and using or finding customers on the other end. So I have decided to bring the load to the generation, then production to the end user. So that's the concept. That's a technology company that I have. And the enterprise universe really is more of a global brand. It does not have its own technologies, but it's going to integrate all of these technology companies. And I'll be creating kind of semi-autonomous companies within that bubble, where the weather company itself is going to have its own team. Right now, I'm handling all of it, but hopefully in the near future, it would have its own management team, and I'll be focusing on the enterprise universe. So the renewable energy company is still in the development stages, Joel. I don't have a product, but I have a US patent on it. I recently got it in 2018.
Oh, wow. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
I know that's hard.
Thing.
No, I understand that's very difficult. Yes.
It is not, and I would not attempt many of them really because of how lengthy a process it is. Some people say it's not that difficult for certain companies because they have the resources and so forth. But even if I have all the resources in the world, going forward, I might not spend a lot of time really trying to get patents based on my experience so far.
That might not be the way to go. Yeah. Though I think that guy, Thomas Edison, had a whole team working on different patents.
Exactly.
Yeah. And he saved money by stealing ideas. So that was.
Yeah, we will not go into that. But okay. Yes, yeah, that does happen. In my case, Joel, my philosophy is this. If you're really a creator, you just should not worry about, people copying you or taking something away from you. It really is about your attitude. What are you in it for? So I'm not really interested in stopping somebody from using. That's good. But if I'm doing better, then they'll come to me, hopefully. So we could team up and do it. That's one of my fundamentals, Joel, where I don't see competitors the same way as others do. Competitors to me are future partners. We just don't really understand each other well right now, because if our goal as a business people, our goal is to make our end users' lives better, our customers' lives better. You are doing the same, I'm doing the same. That means we are on the same team. It's only when your goal is different than mine, then we are on the opposite team. So I think it's really misunderstanding in the competitive world, where collaboration actually makes a lot more sense. You will make more money, I'll make more money, we will have happy customers. But if we struggle and fight over with each other, then the customer is going to get screwed, and we're not going to be happy in the end, really. So, no matter how much money you make, if you haven't made the right impact, it's really come to naught. So that's really what my philosophy is about. And that's what the enterprise universe is about too, Joel. I want this organization to stand on its own as far as the principles, not just how much market cap it has. All that stuff, I don't think anybody really cares in the end. So I just want to make sure the enterprise universe is standing for business, but business is really standing for the end users, the customers.
Well, I love that philosophy. I wish everyone had it.
Thank you.
I think the world would, the the world of capitalism would work a lot better if everyone had that philosophy. I've always thought the Ayn Rand books have been misunderstood in that way. That's what I got from them. It seems like other people got a different idea, but I always thought that, the idea of industry is to give back whatever, to keep things flowing and do good towards. That's the idea. Even Ford, who was had some really terrible things going on, his idea was to build a car using his method was so that his employees could afford his car. So, down deep, that was the idea, was to give back, make it more accessible, and that idea had really changed America at one time, but it seems to have gotten lost now.
It is, and I agree with you in terms of Ford, what their desires were. Yeah, I don't know how we got off the rails. Obviously, there are lots of reasons, but if we're able to change that for the better, which is something that I want to do too, it's not just about churning out products and services, but also making our fellow business colleagues better organizations. So that's through my entrepreneurship fundamentals. And I have this leading concept for organizations also, which is another topic we could talk perhaps down the road. But, there are lots of things that I'm trying to do, not just the technology itself, but also changing the private sector as we know it. Because I spent quite a bit of time, Joel, in the academic sector, as you pointed out.
Right.
I did get quite a few degrees, not it wasn't planned, but it just so happened that I spent quite a bit of time, with 2 masters and a Ph.D. that's on top of my bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. So I know the academic world really well, but I wouldn't be able to fit in there because my focus is not just educating or researching, but creating products. So it's really not the right place for that. And then government sector, obviously, I have a few years under my belt too. So that's, again, you don't really have a well-defined customer when you're a lab scientist. You're kind of doing your research, publishing, and I'm not saying anything negative. They do a lot of great stuff, but they don't really have a customer in mind. There is no customer. And that's why I like the private sector, where you're accountable to your customer. And if you really have the same desire like I do, you will make your product as good as it can be. And that's really where this research came about, as I pointed out early on. Without that desire, Joel, I probably wouldn't have arrived at this technology because of that desire.
Yeah, that is really just a great way of looking at things, and ended up obviously being an advantage. So it sounds like you have an uphill struggle to convince others that your research is needed. It's needed.
It is mostly because they're not trying to understand. It's kind of difficult for them because the science has been practiced for so long. But also my message is getting better too. I got a couple of publications, I made presentations, and I email a lot of my colleagues. We exchange emails. So it's a short story. There was this one colleague of mine. We were exchanging emails for like 30 times, 40 times maybe. And he says, "Well, James, I finally get it." And I'm like, "Great." And then a month later, he was going back to his old way of thinking about it. And I was like, "What happened? I thought you said you got it, but you didn't." So it's kind of hard for that. So that's a struggle. But I think it's getting better because the state variable science that I talk about, it really resonates with a lot of my colleagues because that's exactly what the current science has been doing, and we cannot really address the climate change issue if we rely on that science in that form.
And how can people find out more about all this? If people wanted to get deeper into it and understand science, and they wanted to, learn more about, other than emailing you, how could they find out more about this?
So my central website, Joel, really has all the links.
Mm-hmm.
So for the scientists, I would say go to my ResearchGate link. That's a depository of all of the papers that people publish. So I have my papers listed there. So if they go to my website, they will find a link to ResearchGate, and that would allow them to peruse and even get back to me with some questions that I will be able to, more than happy to answer.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, this has been great. I think I've taken enough of your time today. I could go on. My head is full. I got quite a bit of information. I really, really appreciate you being on. It's so refreshing to have someone that's positive about climate science and positive about business, actually, and positive about capitalization and things we can do that the idea of helping your customer, which helping other people, I think is fantastic, and really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Joel. I appreciate that. I wasn't like this right from the get-go. I was from, like I said, I was a scientist, a good one perhaps, but the evolution of me as a person, going from analytical person to now people person, trying to understand people's needs and putting solutions together and really making them understand complex science into bite-sized messages. So that's really wasn't a forte I had to develop it. And I'm not saying I'm really super good at it, but I'm trying to do the best I could. So that's really all of that together, coming together really is what took a lot of time. But I'm glad I did it because, like you said, I want to make sure that everyone likes private sector because that's where jobs are created.
Right.
We cannot really create a wedge between workers and those who create the jobs, although those job creators are really on for themselves without caring for the workers or any of the society or community. That's a problem too. So that's something that I want to change. But the underlying value private sector businesses bring to the table, they are the ones that are creating the jobs, maybe not doing a good job of sharing and also working with the communities. But that's something that I want to be able to do through my science and my other developments. So I appreciate this opportunity to talk with you. It's a real pleasure.
It's been great. It's been great having you on the podcast, and probably want to have you back if we're able, because there's obviously more we could get into. So I'll just wrap this up by saying you've been listening to Were You Still Talking? This has been Joel Albrecht, and I've been talking to Dr. James Stalker about not only climate change, but climate science and how there might be a completely different way of looking at it that not everyone is seeing. Thanks for listening. Be sure and share with your friends. Go to give it a review. I guess I'm supposed to say that. That's what all the big podcast outlets want you to do. Anyway, thanks a lot for listening, and be back soon. Oh, and be good to each other, and be good to yourself.